My name is Marlene Theodore. I'm the Assistant Curator of Programs here at the Gallery. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here and to introduce our speaker. H. Perry Chapman is a professor and associate chair of the Department of Art History at the University of Delaware. She graduated from Swarthmore and received the PhD in art history from Princeton. Her seminars focus on early modern European art with an emphasis on Northern Baroque painting, the artist's role in society, and methodology in art history. She's a specialist in 17th century Dutch art, including Rembrandt, Vermeer, Jan Steen, as well as in 17th century art theory. Her important and influential book, Rembrandt's Self-Portraits, A Study in 17th Century Identity, appeared in 1990. She has also worked as a curator. She served as co-curator and co-author of the catalog for the memorable exhibition Jan Steen, Painter and Storyteller at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. She held the prestigious position of editor-in-chief at the Art Bulletin from 2000 to 2004, and at present she is chair of the editorial board of the Netherlands Yearbook for History of Art. In her Ryerson lecture today, Rubens, Rembrandt, and the Spousal Model-Muse, Perry Chapman will examine artists' spouses serving as models and muses in the artist's studio, particularly the intimate portraits that Rubens and Rembrandt painted of their wives. This is the final lecture in our series, Views of Dutch Painting of the Golden Age. It has been wonderful seeing so many of you here week after week. If you missed any of these lectures, they are all available online on our YouTube channel. We will be installing the third and final rotation of works from the Rosemary and Ike van Otterloo collection soon, and we will have programming to match next fall and next spring, so I will look forward to seeing you all back here. And for now, Perry, I invite you to deliver your lecture.
Thank you, everyone, for coming on this such a gorgeous day. I will get to Rubens and Rembrandt in just a minute, but before that, I'm going to talk briefly to set the stage about artists from classical antiquity. Tales in which the artist's model is also his or her lover and muse come down to us from antiquity via Pliny the Elder, are retold by the early modern artist biographers, Giorgio Vasari and Carl van Mander, and had some pictorial currency in the 17th century. The painter and theorist Joachim van Sandrart illustrated the story of the Greek sculptor Boutadi's daughter, who, when her lover was going abroad, drew an outline on the wall, the shadow of his face thrown by a lamp. You see that on the left. Van Sandrart took from this tale that drawing was the invention of love. The significance of these anecdotes about classical artists is that they speak to the idea that art originates in love, which is expressed in the topos, love begets art. Jos van Winge, in about 1600, on the right, represented the story of Apelles, painter to Alexander the Great. As Pliny tells it, Alexander engaged Apelles to paint Campaspe, the most beautiful of all his concubines, and he was to paint her undraped or nude. But Apelles fell in love with her, upon which Alexander made him a present of her, thus showing himself, though a great king in courage, a still greater one in self-command. Some persons are of the opinion that Campaspe was the model of Apelles in painting his Venus rising from the sea, hence the shell down right near me. Often taken as a courtly tale about the relation between artist and ruler, and Van Winge produced this painting at court, the story of Apelles and Campaspe is about the inspirational power of eros, beauty, and desire. The Dutch biographer Van Mander, writing in 1604, expressed some discomfort with the story. Because Apelles had more knowledge than Alexander about the beauty of the perfect human body and the appearance of a beautiful woman, so too he was more powerfully confronted with and overcome by unchaste love due to the constant observation of her when he was painting. And of this painting by Van Mander wrote, "As Apelles paints the delightfully beautiful Campaspe, his fire for her ignites." 30 years later, the Antwerp painter Willem van Hecht would have nothing to do with nudity in flaming passion. Instead, he clothed Campaspe in an excessive drapery, and as a modest concession to Pliny's report that she was undraped, opted for the one exposed breast as a sign of virtuous nudity and virtuous love. And love, indeed, was central to art theory in the age of Rubens and Rembrandt, conceptualized as love of God, in a Christian sense, or love of art. It was the artist's driving force and highest goal and motivation, above the others, which were fame and money, the lowest. And erotic love, too, figured in this theory of love, for it also inspired creativity. In a kind of domestication of the idea of the artist's model, Van Hecht set this story of Apelles and Campaspe in the fictional picture gallery of a grand Antwerp house. The semicircular sculpture gallery at rear evokes that in Peter Paul Rubens's house, and indeed Van Hecht had trained with Rubens. The picture must have had special meaning for Van Hecht, for who kept it and bequeathed it to his patron, the spice merchant Cornelis van der Geest. And this is Van Hecht's picture gallery of Cornelis van der Geest, which represents contemporary liefhebbers, literally havers of love, their term for connoisseurs and art lovers, in an exaggerated but real Antwerp Kunstkammer, or art collection, art chamber. The court has come to visit down in the corner. Van Hecht displays one of his prize paintings to Albert and Isabella, the governors of the Spanish Netherlands, as Rubens looks on. High up on the wall here, and here's the detail, is Jan van Eyck's famous but long-lost Woman Bathing, a rare early Netherlandish nude. Note that it is strategically placed just above a copy of Praxiteles' statue of Venus Pudica, or the modest Venus. Van Eyck's nude is sanctioned by its classical heritage. Further indication of the domestication of the artist's model is at least one Antwerp collector, Peter Stevens, thought that Jan van Eyck's wife had served as his model. In the margin of his copy of Van Mander's book of biographies, Stevens wrote, "The most famous bath in which Van Eyck has painted the portrait of his wife nude and clothed." My talk today is about the domesticated spousal Model-Muse. By this I mean that I will explore what happened to the notion that the artist's model is his lover and muse when the model was also his wife, and this in urban merchant societies, Catholic Antwerp and Calvinist Amsterdam, that frowned on nudity. I'm going to tell you two intertwined two-part stories about Rubens and Rembrandt, who had set himself the challenge of rivaling Rubens. Each painter had two wives, or more accurately, Rubens married twice. On the left is Het Pelskin, the little fur coat, Rubens's extraordinarily intimate painting of his second wife, Helena Formant. Strictly speaking, Rembrandt married once. His Woman Bathing may or may not represent, the Rubens is on the left, I'm not sure what I said. Rembrandt's Woman Bathing, here close to me, may or may not represent Hendricke Stoffels, Rembrandt's second common-law wife. When we get to these second wives, we encounter the issue of the spouse as nude model. We know that 17th century artists, and Rubens and Rembrandt specifically, readily used unclothed male models, probably often their studio assistants. but whether and to what extent they employed nude female models is a topic of current debate. And employed is the operative word, since female models were often prostitutes wanting to make a bit of extra money. The overwhelming consensus seems to be that they didn't use their wives as models much at all. But I want to re-examine the question of the wife as model from the perspective of love. I will explore whether love, of the sort that gives birth to art, and the heritage of appellees trumped morality and justified nudity. For Rubens, I think they did, in large part because, with the exception of this intimate portrait, Rubens paints the nude Helena Formant in a court context and with explicit reference to the classical tradition. Rubens, in other words, conformed to the rules of art. Rembrandt is another story. If, as I suspect, he painted and drew Hendrika in the nude, he did so more outside the law, that is, somewhat subversively, and with little regard for the social norms of burgerlich Amsterdam. First, let's look at first wives in clothes. This stunningly grand double portrait, which dates to about 1609, commemorates the marriage of Rubens and Isabella Brandt, daughter of Jan Brandt, one of Antwerp's wealthiest and most distinguished citizens. After 8 years in Italy, Rubens had returned to Antwerp, where he found immediate success, married, and soon acquired property in which to house his family and thriving studio. Here, Rubens has painted himself in the finest of clothes, from his broad lace collar to his orange silk stockings. He holds the hilt of his sword. Though not a noble, Rubens carried it by rights, for he had been appointed court painter to the governors of the Netherlands. Isabella wears splendid lace, brocade, and satin. Elevated above her, Rubens claims his role as husband and protector, but together they form a formidable pair of prosperous Antwerp patricians. Yet for all their finery, they are surprisingly, innovatively casual, for they are seated, holding hands, and Isabella seemingly on the ground, in the honeysuckle bower of a love garden. Fragrant honeysuckle, with its powerful clinging vine, signified devoted, lasting love. The extraordinary import of love for the artist suggests that the love garden refers not only to their marriage, but also to the love that inspires Rubens's art. In 1609, Rubens and Isabella were living in the home of her father. Presumably the portrait first hung there. But let's imagine it soon hung in this grand house. Rubens purchased the property in 1610, and it took some years to complete what was, in effect, a magnificent architectural self-portrait. In this print, you see the facade at bottom composed of an old Flemish part and the brand new Italianate studio wing. And that same studio wing is here, seen from the back. The sculpture gallery is here, the grand bedroom is here. The portrait on the left, which Anthony van Dyck painted as an act of loving friendship for Rubens in 1621, captures the dignified elegance of the patrician Isabella Brandt, here posed before really a triumphal arch that separated the courtyard of Rubens's house from the formal gardens. Who knows what went on in private, but there's no evidence that Rubens drew or painted her in the nude. Seems kind of unlikely. We know that when he was painting the Marie de Medici cycle, Rubens hired models, probably prostitutes. In a letter of 1623, he orders up 3, writing, "I beg you to arrange to secure for me, for the 3rd week after this one, the 2 Capillo ladies of the Rue de Verbois, and also the little niece Louisa, for I intend to make 3 studies of sirens in life size, and these 3 persons will be of infinitely great help to me, partly because of the wonderful expression of their faces, but even more for their superb black hair, which I find it difficult to obtain elsewhere, and also by their stature. Their stature meant their bodies, which is probably what he was mostly interested in, to use them as models for these, the sirens here. It's hard to imagine the little Louisa as one of these massive nudes. Yet Rubens's nudes, with all their living flesh and lush corpulence, the accidents of nature, arise from a practice that insisted on transforming the study of classical statues through selective imitation. Rubens's nudes epitomize what they then called working naar het leven, or from life, and by that he would have meant both from the classical statue, drawing directly from it, and from the live model. But this was all in the service of creating uit den geest, or from the imagination. So I'm not sure that Rubens fully conceptualized his first wife as a muse, or a model muse. He gives some of his Madonnas vaguely Isabella-like facial features, but mostly he sticks to painting portraits of her. After Isabella died of the plague in 1626, Rubens wrote, "Truly I have lost an excellent companion, whom one could love, indeed had to love with good reason, as having none of the faults of her sex. She had no capricious moods and no feminine weakness, but was all goodness and beauty." Rembrandt's first wife, Saskia van Eilenberg, was the orphaned daughter of a burgomaster of Leeuwarden and the cousin of Hendrik van Eilenberg, the Amsterdam painter and art dealer for whom Rembrandt worked before he established his own studio. Rembrandt does not appear to have drawn or painted Saskia nude, although he had no qualms about casting her in an unflattering guise in this large and unusual double portrait, which is dated to probably about 1635, the year after their marriage. Rembrandt smiles, or perhaps even laughs, and raises his tall beer glass as Saskia turns back to look at us. We know the setting is a tavern because of the tally board up here. This painting was long interpreted as Rembrandt and Saskia flaunting their newfound wealth in the face of their staid society, or in response to accusations from Saskia's family that they were squandering her inheritance. More likely, this is a historicized portrait in which Rembrandt plays the role of the biblical prodigal son, squandering his patrimony in a tavern, in which case Rembrandt's helpmate has become his whore. Their extravagant, fanciful clothing and the peacock pie, right here, and its feathers go up here, comment on worldly excess. Especially in Calvinist Holland, the sinful prodigal's return home and acceptance by his father was taken as a metaphor for God's loving acceptance of all sinners. Even though Rembrandt could not have seen Rubens's double portrait, I would like to suggest that this is Rembrandt's response to it. News traveled, and Rembrandt knew people, Constantine Haukens, the secretary to the Stadtholder of the Dutch Republic, for example, who knew Rubens very well. And Rubens's marvelous double portrait would have been the talk of Liefhebbers and artists. Only if you'd been a guest in Rubens's house could you say you'd seen it. Suppose Rembrandt had heard that Rubens had painted a large and extravagant marriage portrait set in a love garden. I'd like to remind you that Rembrandt's intense interest in and pictorial rivalry with Rubens during the 1630s was quite something, and it's exemplified by the blinding of Samson, here on the right, of 1636, in which Rembrandt pointedly responded to Rubens's Prometheus Bound, which had been in The Hague for a time, which he probably saw as a very young man. Prometheus Bound, which is in Philadelphia, by the way, demonstrates Rubens's commitment to and ideas about imitating classical sculpture. In Rome, Rubens had made drawings after the best of the antique sculptures. These he would use throughout his life as the basis for his paintings. He also wrote about the imitation of statues as part of a projected theoretical treatise. To attain the highest perfection in painting, he wrote, it is necessary to understand the antiques, to be so thoroughly possessed of this knowledge that it may diffuse itself everywhere. Yet it must be judiciously applied so that one's paintings must not in the least smell of stone. Rubens believed that the ancients, who exercised their bodies every day so violently as to sweat and fatigue them, were actually more beautiful and more fit than the people of his day, when most men give no other exercise to their body but eating and drinking. Rubens was convinced that, via his study of sculpture, he could improve upon the human body, rendering it totally lifelike, but far better than life. Here we see him turning over the agonized Laocoon, borrowing this pose with one arm up and one down, and through paint, transforming that classical sculpture into heroic but living flesh. In response to Rubens's mythology, Rembrandt reinterprets the Laocoon-based Prometheus as a much more boldly real, tormented Samson. The eagle's eternal devouring of the liver becomes the momentary, immediate, far more dramatic and gory gouging of the eye. In the art theory of this time, this kind of emulation, in which one refers recognizably to an exemplary model, was reserved for the best masters. Lesser painters shouldn't show their sources. Further, in paying homage to an earlier work, the artist was advised to aim for what the 17th century theorist Franciscus Junius called dissimilar similarity, which the artist could achieve by inventively changing the subject, as Rembrandt has done here, from mythology to Old Testament subject. So back to the portraits. This print of the Parable of the Prodigal Son by Claes Jansson Fischer, after Vinkbones, suggests how we might see Rembrandt's self-portrait with Saskia as an inventive shifting of Rubens's subject, as dissimilar similarity. Love gardens, the settings for outdoor married companies such as this, were associated specifically with the scene in which the prodigal squanders his inheritance. And note here in the background is a tavern. Here's its sign, and the prodigal is being driven out of the tavern after that squandering of the inheritance. So, perhaps, in response to Rubens's conjugal love garden with its honeysuckle bower, Rembrandt aimed to go him one better and evoke a different kind of love, the erotic love that ignites passion and moves the artist to heights of creativity. It's a transgression in biblical guise in which Saskia is complicit. At about the same time, Rembrandt produced this etching, which makes explicit Saskia's role as domesticated Model-Muse. Rembrandt represents himself in the process of drawing, perhaps on an etching plate. This print has a direct, true-to-life quality, as if he's drawing himself and Saskia in the mirror. She is his muse and somewhat stern companion in his game of role-playing and dressing up in fanciful clothes. Rembrandt's portraits of Saskia tend to be about love. With this seemingly casual silver point drawing, Rembrandt marked their engagement. It's inscribed, "This is the likeness of my wife when she was 21 years old, on the third day after we were betrothed, 8 June 1633. Saskia's plain straw hat, decorated with a wreath of flowers, and her night rail, a white linen shoulder covering worn at night and in the house, suggests she's in an informal state of undress. The portrait seems natural, completely unpremeditated. Silver point on prepared paper suggests it may have been drawn in a sketchbook, perhaps out of doors. Yet its conceit is in keeping with the current vogue for pastoral portraits, and Saskia's proffered flower is a trope of marriage portraits. It may identify her with Flora or Glycera. Rembrandt painted several portraits of Saskia in fanciful, romanticized, or pastoral guises that evoke erotic love. On the left is Saskia as Flora, goddess of flowers, spring, fertility, and love. She wears clothing that would have been called antique, meaning old-fashioned and historical. Less elaborate, but equally imaginary and historicizing, is Saskia with the flower of 1641 on the right. It makes reference to Titian's Flora, which was in Amsterdam in 1639. However, in emulating Titian, it appears that Rembrandt changed the subject of his picture to create a dissimilar similarity. Stephanie Dickey has identified Saskia not with Flora, but with Glycera, who, according to Pliny, first invented wreaths of flowers, and who was the lover of the ancient Greek painter Pausias, who was famed for his medium and caustic, and for his portrait of Glycera that was called the Wreath Binder. According to Franciscus Junius, Pausias, being exceedingly in love with his countrywoman Glycera, left a most famous picture, and this has ever been esteemed his best work, because he was enforced thereunto by the extremity of his passion. Here, Saskia's direct gaze, she has eyes only for Rembrandt, her proffered carnation, and I don't know that you can see them, but there are flowers on the plinth behind her, identify her as Glycera and transform Rembrandt into Pausias, painting her portrait inspired by love. Between 1635 and 41, Rembrandt and Saskia had 4 children, but only Titus, the last one, lived. And Saskia was not well. She died in 1642 at almost age 30. Rembrandt must have spent hours at her bedside. His several intimate, loving, true-to-life drawings of her show her in a state as vulnerable as nakedness. Back to Rubens. In 1630, at age 53, Rubens married again. He wrote to his friend, the French intellectual and collector Peiresc, "I was not yet inclined to live the life of a celibate. I have taken a young wife of honest but middle-class family, although everyone tried to persuade me to make a court marriage. But I feared pride, that inherent vice of the nobility, particularly in that sex, and that is why I chose one who would not blush to see me take my brushes in hand. And to tell the truth, it would have been hard for me to exchange the priceless treasure of liberty for the embraces of an old woman." Now, who knows what he meant by an old woman? Helena Formant, the youngest daughter of actually a wealthy Antwerp silk and tapestry merchant, was 16. In this lavish first portrait of her, Rubens paints her eagerness as she leans towards him. The sprig of myrtle in her hair alludes to Venus. Kristen Belkin, the Rubens scholar, has written about her bouffant hairstyle, which was the latest fashion from Paris. Helena wore short bangs, called a garcette, with some of her curly hair cut short at the sides, and you can see how it frizzes here. The rest is tied up into a flat bun at the back of her head. Rubens uses this hairdo to distinguish Helena in his many paintings of her. Within the 10 years of their marriage, she bore him 5 children. He paints and draws her and the children repeatedly, and he includes her in poetic allegories and mythologies having to do with love. In The Garden of Love, a quasi-classicized contemporary allegory of love, Helena is the young woman here at the center. Actually, a number of the women look like her, but I think this is really her looking out at you. Here she is. She's over here. In the Feast of Venus of the mid-1630s, the subject is inspired both by Titian's famous painting and by ancient literary sources. One of these sources, the description of a lost Greek painting, and the other was Ovid's description of the Feast of Venus Verticordia, in which the women of Latium make sacrifices to Venus in hopes of being preserved from uncontrollable desire. In the Judgment of Paris, which Rubens painted for Philip IV of Spain, Helena is Venus, the nude at the center. We recognize her by her features and her hair. Would he have posed his beautiful young wife in the nude in the studio? Some critics have argued that surely not. And by the mid-1630s, he wouldn't have needed to, having so internalized his trademark female nude. But then again, maybe he had specific intentions in mind when he chose, instead of a noblewoman, a middle-class wife who would not blush to see me take my brushes in hand. That has been taken as his modest comment on his trade. Being a painter was no occupation for a real gentleman, let alone a nobleman. But perhaps it refers to what might actually cause a woman to blush, his drawing and painting her in the nude. Of this Judgment of Paris, Cardinal Infante Ferdinand wrote to Philip IV that the Venus in the center is a very good likeness of his wife, who is certainly the handsomest woman to be seen here. Yet giving voluptuous, classical-ish nudes, Helena's features and coiffure was perhaps not as transgressive as it might seem. Rubens' commitment to the classical ideal through antique statuary and mythological subjects, and the fundamental basis of his nudes and his imagination may have meant that he used his wife as a model with decorum and eloquence, out of love, in the service of a truly classical celebration of the beautiful human body. Het Pelskin, the little fur or the little fur coat, is one of the most intimate and most delightful portraits of all time. It dates to about 1638, when Helena would have been 24, Rubens 60. Rubens's joy and pleasure are abundantly evident. Again, he paints his wife as Venus, and in so doing claims to be the second Apelles. Het Pelskin transforms the modest pose of the Venus Pudica, remember which we saw earlier below Jan van Eyck's nude. This painting transforms the modest pose of the Venus Pudica into something deliberately revealing and overtly erotic in a conjugal sort of way. It also draws on Titian's Woman in a Fur, which was probably a portrait of a courtesan, which Rubens had copied around 1630. However, a print by Rubens's engraver, Lucas Forstermann, after Rubens identifies a different painting of a courtesan by Titian as a portrait of Titian's wife. So they seem to have a little confusion there. It is probably, by the way, the fur is probably Rubens's fur-lined coat that Helena wraps around herself so provocatively. Recent technical examination of the painting has revealed that originally there was a fountain, and that fountain is here. And here there was a naked peeing little boy, like the mannequin piece in Brussels. And that's an actual type that goes back to antiquity. It's been suggested that Rubens painted it out because of its erotic connotations, or perhaps it was because he wanted to evoke not a love garden, but going to bed. Kristen Belkin has argued that this drawing shows Helena in bed, or as if in bed. Her chemise beside her, she wears nothing but a white linen band, a bandeau, across her forehead, which she also wears in het pelskin. And this is what I love, when people figure these things out. Women wore these at night. Covered with cream, they were thought to prevent wrinkles. But in some of Rembrandt's drawings, Saskia wears a wider one that probably had medicinal ointment in it. Rubens, through Helena, crafted himself as a new Apelles, his passion ignited by a beautiful woman. We don't know who beyond them would have seen het pelskin. Maybe lots of people saw it in their house. Maybe it was private. But we do know that Rubens kept it. He left the painting to her in his will, and she, in turn, almost left it to her second husband, but then she changed her mind. We think that these portraits by Rembrandt are all of Hendrika Stoffels. All are historicized, and at least two are based on Italian prototypes. The one here at right shows Hendrika as Flora. Hendrika is in many ways emblematic of Rembrandt's increasing nonconformity. After Saskia's death, Rembrandt had a rocky interlude with Titus's nursemaid Gertke Dirks, who sued him for breach of promise of marriage. And after some legal whatever, she ended up in the Spin House, the House of Corrections, which is one of the reasons some people think Rembrandt may not have been a very nice man, but we really don't know. Perhaps she wasn't so nice. We just have no idea. But then Rembrandt settled down with Hendrika, who he could not marry because of stipulations in Saskia's will. Pregnant with his daughter Cornelia, Hendrika was called 2 times before the church council, that of the Reformed Calvinist Church, and accused of living like a whore with Rembrandt. After Rembrandt's bankruptcy, itself a sign of his disregard for social norms, Hendrika and Titus, his son, took over his business. Rembrandt may have used Hendrika as a model for Old Testament subjects, such as Bathsheba at the bath, spied on by King David on the left. Hendrika is also assumed to be the model for a woman bathing in a stream, which may represent Susanna, in which case we or Rembrandt would be the elders who spied on her. So both are women who were spied on and in a sense violated. Rembrandt used nudity in his histories not for its own sake usually, but to tell a story. The question of Rembrandt's use of nude female models is much debated, and I will confess that I had hoped to have something more definitive to say, but I don't. The current consensus, with which I don't necessarily agree, is that he would not have used Hendrika to model nude. This conclusion is based only partly on evidence and a lot on morals, both the presumed morality of the time and of today's art historians. In contrast, I would like to be able to say that these were Rembrandt's loving representations of a familiar, and I think that seems entirely possible. And that this transgression of the moral code was justified for him by the practices of Apelles and Rubens. And besides, increasingly, Rembrandt really didn't care what others thought. Current thinking has it that Rembrandt used female models only after about 1650, even though he had promoted himself as drawing from the nude quite early on. The nude seated on the mound of 1631 on the left, whether or not it was actually drawn from life, makes the claim that it was through its heightened naturalism. It exemplifies Rembrandt's rejection of the idealized classical body in favor of a new and idiosyncratic practice of using ordinary people as models and representing them with all their wrinkles and folds of flesh. The nude on the mound is the one that was criticized by one of his contemporaries slightly later for showing even the marks of the garters on her legs, and literally of like the tops of your knee socks or something. Her fleshiness is akin to that of Rubens's nudes, even though the end result is so dramatically different. By 1631, Rubens was already renowned for his nudes. It is possible to imagine that here Rembrandt was trying to achieve and possibly even subvert the beautiful corporality of Rubens's female nudes without probably having seen any. Rembrandt's artist drawing from a model of about 1640, too, makes a claim about drawing from the nude. Yet the nude model is based on Galatea, in this print by Peter Fedes van Harlingen, which represents Pygmalion. Remember, because of his love, Pygmalion's sculpture Galatea came to life. Again, the power of love in artistic creation. Rembrandt transforms his source into a new subject. It may be that he draws Venus for her pose, seen from the back and with drapery over her arm, also refers to a famous Venus, which is known as Venus with the beautiful buttocks, or Venus with the fair backside. Eric Jan Slaughter suggests that Rembrandt has here represented himself as Apelles painting Victory, for Van Mander, in a mistranslation of his classical source, reports that Apelles made a painting of Victory. And Slaughter, one of the questions with this wonderful print is why it was left unfinished. Slaughter thinks maybe it was unfinished because the nude was so obviously not from life, and therefore it was not a success in Rembrandt's mind. Other people have argued that he left it unfinished deliberately to show the process of drawing underlying the finished etching. By 1646, Rembrandt and his pupils were working from male models. Rembrandt's etchings of male models posing in the studio, like the one on the left, along with drawings that his pupils made of the same figures at the very same time, attest to the practice of gathering to draw from the nude model. This heightened degree of fidelity to the imperfect live model announced Rembrandt's radically new kind of truthfulness to nature. The accusation that Rembrandt, like Caravaggio, could not paint without a live model in front of him, could not paint or draw without a live model in front of him, implied that he had failed to make drawing the body, the ideal body, a habit. The drawing on the right by Rembrandt's pupil Constantine van Renesse provides evidence that by about 1650, academy-like drawing sessions with female models were held in Rembrandt's studio. Samuel van Hoogstraten, who had been Rembrandt's pupil, recommends attending drawing schools or academies in order to draw male or female nudes from life. Willem Gore recommended drawing after nude models twice a week. However, ample evidence suggests that in Calvinist Amsterdam, posing in the nude would have been compromising for any woman, even a prostitute. 5 painters, including Rembrandt's former pupils, Ferdinand Bol and Govert Flink, testified in court that Katrina Jans sat stark naked before these witnesses and other colleagues as a model, and that they, the witnesses, drew and painted her thus. There are a number of court cases like this. Painting nudes could also be compromising for artists. The historian of Haarlem in 1648 described Johannes Torrentius as infamous. He was a second Apelles, as he could paint nude women who presented themselves to him like whores. Joachim von Sandrart, too, wrote of a number of paintings of naked women, very inappropriate and vulgar, absolutely unworthy of praise, by this same Torrentius, who sought his models in a brothel in The Hague. That Rembrandt held group drawing sessions has been taken as evidence that the model for drawings such as these could not have been Hendrika. Maybe, but who knows? Artists insist on, and their spousal muses put up with, all kinds of things. And perhaps it's because I've recently spent a good deal of time studying Rembrandt's Amsterdam house that I have a hard time imagining a prostitute creeping up the stairs to the studio. Or maybe the drawing on the right of a model seated half-dressed in Rembrandt's studio. Here's the easel. And this is the basis for the reconstruction of the studio in Rembrandt's house that you can see in Amsterdam. Maybe this drawing suggests an answer. It's about real life and practice in the studio. On the table in front of the model, right here, is a very small cradle, which suggests that this is Hendrika with the new infant, Cornelia. Or maybe Rembrandt did bring prostitutes into model. These etchings of 1658, which also seem to be about posing in the studios, suggest Rembrandt's discomfort with and sympathy for the naked model. Neither of these women looks much like Hendrika, though admittedly it's hard to tell. In the etching on the left, the model sits on what appears to be a bed, and beside her is a black hat, the hat of a man, suggesting a man whose visit is only temporary. Woman seated by a stove also evokes prostitution, for the oval relief on the stove shows Mary Magdalene, who had gained the reputation of being a prostitute. Rembrandt almost always had to have a reason for making a nude. Here in The Woman with an Arrow, one of Rembrandt's very last etchings, she is Venus with Cupid looking up at her. Where is he? He's in here somewhere. No, he's not. He's over here. Where am I? Over here. She is eroticized as an updated version of that famous classical Venus known as the Venus with the fair backside. Drawing her from the back, Rembrandt does not have to confront her gaze. Indeed, with the exception of the early and remarkably assertive nude seated on a mound, all of the nudes by Rembrandt that I've shown today either avert their eyes or turn their heads away from the viewer. It is as if Rembrandt, in the most empathetic of ways, wants to preserve their dignity. Het Pelskin is all about love and all about Rubens and his complete assimilation of the classical celebration of the beautiful, ideal, but living nude body. Her attentiveness to him and only him, her luscious body, her fertility are all in celebration of his art, perhaps art more broadly, and a confirmation of his creative virility. Rembrandt's approach to the female nude is fundamentally different. For him, nakedness is about exposure, whether to King David, to the leering elders, or to the artist or group of artists in the studio. His late nudes, whether or not they are Hendrika, are more true to life, pensive. Their absorption draws him and us in, even when they are seen from the back. Rembrandt makes her into a living, thinking being, even when she is Venus. For all his nonconformity, I tend to think that he feels her nakedness, her exposure. Yet still, through the nude Venus, Rubens and Rembrandt each likens himself to Apelles and claims to be motivated by love. Thank you. Do questions? I'm happy to answer questions if anybody has a question. Yes.
In the Garden of Love, you show us. In the Garden of Love, you show us Helena at center Does Rubens put himself in that painting?
In the Garden of Love. Oh, in the Garden of Love. You know, there is a figure in that painting that looks kind of like Rubens, but if it is, it's a much, much younger Rubens. So I think he's imagining him. So it's a wonderful question, because I think, in fact, he probably is kind of imagining himself there as a young man over at the left-hand side. Yeah. It's all about imagination. Yes.
What was the attitude at the time to the classical Roman and Greek nude sculptures?
Oh,
Statues?
they were tremendously important at the time. Rubens knew and studied classical sculpture. He thought it had to be the basis of his art. And classical sculptures were widely known and collected, and you could get Roman copies of Greek sculptures, but I think mainly they had plaster casts that were probably made in great numbers in life size and small size. Rembrandt, too, knew his classical sculpture. He owned, in fact, among other sculptures, he owned a pissing child, which was a copy of a classical sculpture. He also owned 12 busts of Roman Republican rulers that he kept in chronological order, which does suggest that Rembrandt had knowledge of classical history. But Rembrandt could be rather irreverent in his use of classical sculpture in his art. So they had two different approaches to classical sculpture, but they both knew, Rubens knew a huge amount about classical sculpture. Rembrandt too, but not as much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.